He chained his pregnant wife in the backyard like an animal, until the Mafia Boss unchained her and caged him instead. Calla Halden huddled against the weathered wooden post, her heavily pregnant body folded in on itself as if she could somehow make herself smaller, invisible, forgettable. The red dress she wore, the one Rourke had selected for her just weeks ago, back when selection still felt like choice, now clung to her in damp patches where tears and snow had soaked the fabric. Her long blonde hair, once the color of winter sunlight, hung in frozen strands around her face, small icicles catching what little light the late afternoon offered. Her bare feet were the worst part, not the worst physically, though the cold had stolen all sensation from her toes hours ago, which she knew, in some distant medical corner of her mind, was probably dangerous. But the worst spiritually, morally, in some essential human way. Feet on frozen ground, bare skin against snow, the undeniable message of her captivity made manifest in the simple, brutal fact that she was not allowed shoes. The chain around her ankle was thick iron, industrial, the kind of restraint designed for livestock or machinery. It had been polished once. Rourke had insisted on that. He'd wanted it to shine, to catch light, to make a statement. Even her imprisonment had to be aesthetically pleasing to him. The chain ran from her ankle to the wooden post behind her, anchored with a padlock that looked absurdly small against the weight of what it held. Icicles hung from the links like crystallized tears, each one a moment of exposure, each one evidence of how long she'd been out here. Beside her, the black dog, Rourke's dog, technically, though the animal had long ago chosen her as its loyal companion, pressed close to her leg. The dog's body was warm, and Calla held onto that warmth like a lifeline, her hand buried in the coarse black fur. The animal's name was Shadow, which Rourke had found poetic. "Like you're just a shadow of what you used to be," he'd said with that smile of his, the one that looked warm until you looked into his eyes and saw the absolute absence of anything resembling empathy. The snow fell in gentle flakes, deceptively peaceful. Behind her, through the wooden slats of the shed structure, she could hear the muffled sounds of the house. A television, Rourke's voice, low and controlled, the clink of a glass, his mother's sharp laugh, his mother who'd moved in last month and somehow made everything infinitely worse by validating his every cruelty as necessary discipline. Inside that house was warmth, heat from the fireplace, the smell of dinner, the simple, taken-for-granted comfort of existing indoors while the temperature dropped and the sky darkened and winter pressed down with increasing violence. Out here, there was only cold, only the chain, only the growing ache in her lower back where the baby seemed to press harder each day, as if the child inside her also understood the danger of their situation and was trying to escape. Calla's throat was raw from crying. Her cheeks were chapped from tears and wind. Her mind, which had once been sharp and organized, she'd been an accountant before, she'd managed numbers and systems and had been respected for her precision, was now fractured into moments. She couldn't think in terms of tomorrow or next week. She could only think in terms of the next hour. Will he leave her out here all night? Will the cold get worse? Will the baby come early, here in the snow, with only Shadow as witness? The red dress was meant to be humiliating in its contrast, so bright against the white snow, so clearly visible from the house windows. He could see her whenever he wanted. She was on display. She was a reminder to herself and to the world that she belonged to him, that she had no autonomy, no rights, no humanity beyond what he granted her. Some debts never expire, some people never forget, and some chains, once fastened, seem designed to hold forever. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of an engine. Not Rourke's truck. Something else. Something heavy and deliberate and approaching from the direction of the main road. Calla lifted her head. The motion sent fresh pain through her neck. She looked toward the sound, her swollen belly making even small movements an exercise in discomfort, her breath catching in her throat. Who was coming? Rourke's associates. Would that make this better or worse? Or was this simply another vehicle passing by, indifferent to the pregnant woman chained in the snow, indifferent to the dog keeping her warm, indifferent to the quiet catastrophe unfolding in what was supposed to be the safety of someone's backyard? The sound grew closer. The engine sound was wrong, too deep, too powerful, too purposeful for a casual visit. Some stories are about rescue. Some stories are about revenge. But the most powerful stories are about reclamation. The moment when a person realizes they don't need to be saved by someone else. They need to save themselves. What you're about to witness is not a simple tale of a woman escaping her chains. It's the story of a woman learning that true freedom isn't about who removes the chains. It's about who she becomes after they're gone. It's about a pregnant woman in a red dress discovering that her abuser never owned her at all, no matter how many chains he fastened. And it's about the price that man will pay when he crosses paths with someone willing to speak the language of his cruelty and teach him exactly how it feels. The backyard is cold. The chains are real, but what happens next will change everything. If this story moves you, if it speaks to your understanding of survival and justice and the darker forms of redemption, we invite you to witness what comes next. Because sometimes the most powerful chains are the ones we break ourselves. Where are you joining us from today? If Calla's strength in the face of such cruelty moves you, please comment below and let us know. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video to stand against the shadows. Subscribe to the channel now so you never miss the next chapter of this journey from captivity to cold, hard justice. The headlights cut through the winter dusk like a blade, 3 black SUVs moving in coordinated silence down the rural road. No sirens, no announcement, just the methodical approach of men who were used to taking what they came for. Tavian virally sat in the back of the lead vehicle, his expression a mask of contained fury. The folder lay open on his lap, photographs, medical records, witness statements, all of it damning. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. A man had chained his pregnant wife to a post in his backyard and left her there to freeze. The investigator, Wallace Greer, had sent the final report 3 hours ago. That was all the time it took for Tavian to mobilize his resources and redirect his evening plans. Everything else, the business meeting in Seattle, the transactions waiting for his signature, the carefully constructed web of legitimate enterprises that masked his actual work, could wait. Some things couldn't. The lead vehicle slowed as they approached the property. A sprawling rural house set back from the main road, surrounded by fencing that suggested privacy rather than protection. Tavian's operative, Dominic, turned to him from the passenger seat. 3 occupants inside, Dominic said quietly. The husband, the mother, and a younger male, likely the brother. No security system beyond standard locks. They're not expecting company. Tavian nodded once. He'd learned long ago that people who committed this kind of abuse rarely did so out of fear of discovery. They did it because they believed they were untouchable. That was their fatal flaw. The vehicles came to a stop outside the main gate. Tavian didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the house in the distance. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of interior lighting. Somewhere in that house, a man was watching television while his heavily pregnant wife froze outside. The image made something turn cold in Tavian's chest, not rage, exactly. Rage was impulsive, destructive. This was something colder and more dangerous, clarity. The kind of clarity that came when you recognized your own past in someone else's present. How long? He asked. The neighbor reported seeing her out there 2 days ago, Dominic replied. She was chained then. High probability she's still out there now. The property is isolated enough that no one would intervene. 2 days, 72 hours in winter, pregnant. Tavian stood, buttoning his coat with deliberate precision. The fabric was expensive Italian wool, the cut tailored to hide the reality of what he was. A man who operated in the spaces between law and chaos, answering to a code that existed nowhere but inside his own mind. "Let's move," he said. The gate was unlocked, another careless mistake. Rourke Halden had never learned that safety was a matter of discipline, not assumption. The snow crunched under Tavian's feet as he moved across the property, his men flanking him in a formation that was practiced and silent. They wore dark clothing, moved with military efficiency, looked like exactly what they were, men who solved problems through force. Dominic moved toward the front entrance. Two other men circled toward the back. Tavian's gaze, however, fixed on the wooden structure near the rear corner of the property. He could see her. Even from a distance, the red dress was impossible to miss against the white snow. The contrast was almost obscene, bright, visible, deliberately arranged. And the chain. The thick iron chain that ran from her ankle to a wooden post, icicles crystallizing along its length like frozen tears. Tavian's jaw tightened. He'd seen violence before. He'd participated in it, orchestrated it, understood it as a language necessary for survival in his world. But this was different. This was the calculated degradation of someone vulnerable, done not in passion but in cold deliberation. He changed direction, moving away from the house toward the figure huddled against the post. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. The blonde hair matted with snow, the tear-streaked face, the way her whole body trembled, though he couldn't tell if it was from cold or fear. Beside her, a black dog lifted its head, watching him with the kind of wariness that came from living around cruelty. Calla, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, a shocking contrast to his appearance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that commanded rooms. But his voice, in this moment, was careful. Her head lifted slowly. The movement seemed to cause her pain. Her eyes, swollen from crying, wide with a confusion that suggested her mind wasn't quite processing what was happening, focused on him with difficulty. "Who?" Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt down, his expensive coat getting damp from the snow, his attention entirely on the padlock that secured the chain. It was a good lock, expensive, well-maintained. The kind of lock designed to hold something you valued and wanted to keep. "The name is Tavian," he said quietly, examining the mechanism. "And I'm here to get you out of here." Behind him, he heard raised voices from the house. Dominic had made his entrance. Calla's whole body went rigid. No, you don't understand. If you make him angry." "He's already angry," Tavian interrupted, not unkindly. He pulled a small tool from his pocket, nothing elaborate, just the kind of thing a man in his position carried for situations like this. "He's been angry the whole time he's had you out here. Anger doesn't change what I'm about to do." Her eyes darted toward the house. Through the windows, Tavian could see movement. Chaos. Dominic and the others were doing their work, not violent but utterly immobilizing. By the time Rourke Halden had any kind of organized thought in his head, this would be over. The lock clicked open. The sound was small, almost insignificant in the darkness, but Calla flinched like it was thunder. Tavian carefully removed the shackle from her ankle. Her skin underneath was raw, infected. The cold had probably saved her from worse, the low temperature acting like an anesthetic, numbing the wound even as it created new dangers. He set the shackle down gently and looked at her. "Can you stand?" She shook her head. "I can't feel my feet, I don't think." He didn't give her time to finish the thought. Instead, he lifted her, cradling her carefully against his chest, hyper-aware of her pregnant belly between them. The black dog scrambled to its feet and followed, pressing against Tavian's leg. "What's the dog's name?" he asked, not because it mattered in the grand scheme of things, but because sometimes the small questions were the ones that helped shock a traumatized mind back into the present. "Shadow," she whispered. "His name is Shadow." Then Shadow comes too. From the house came the sound of angry shouting. Rourke, finally understanding that his world was collapsing. The voice was loud, indignant, the sound of a man accustomed to authority suddenly finding that authority meaningless. Tavian didn't slow his pace. He moved toward the waiting vehicles with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything in his life. Behind him, he could hear his men securing the property, making certain that Rourke understood exactly what was happening. The tables had turned. As he placed Calla gently into the back seat of the lead SUV, wrapping her in the blanket Dominic immediately produced, Tavian made a silent decision. Rourke Halden had imprisoned this woman. He'd chained her like an animal. He'd made her believe she deserved suffering. That error was going to cost him everything. Tavian's reflection in the SUV's window showed a man without mercy, without hesitation. A man who operated by a code that existed nowhere in the legal system, nowhere in the moral frameworks of ordinary people. He shut the door gently and turned back toward the house. There was work to do. 3 years earlier, the coffee shop was unremarkable, the kind of place where accountants grabbed their morning caffeine before disappearing into spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Calla sat in the corner booth, her laptop open, a half-eaten croissant beside her. She was calculating debt-to-equity ratios for a corporate client, the numbers blurring together in that comfortable way that meant her mind was engaged. She didn't notice him at first. Rourke Halden had that quality, the ability to enter a room without announcing himself, to settle into a space as if it had always been meant for him. He ordered coffee at the counter, scanned the room, and his eyes landed on her. Later, Calla would wonder if that moment of eye contact had been accidental or calculated. By the time she understood the difference, it was too late. He approached her table with a smile that reached his eyes. "Is that seat taken?" She should have said yes. Some instinct inside her, a voice she would come to recognize as her true self, whispered that warning. But she was lonely. Her career had consumed her 30s, and at 34, she was beginning to understand that professional success didn't keep you warm at night. "No," she said, "please." His name was Rourke. He was charming in the way that men who are dangerous often are. He asked questions and actually listened to her answers. He made her feel seen. Over the next 6 months, he became a regular fixture in her life. Coffee dates became dinner. Dinner became weekends away. He would arrive at her apartment with flowers and tell her that he understood her, that she deserved to be taken care of. "A woman like you shouldn't have to worry about anything," he said one evening, his hand gentle on her cheek. "Let me handle things. Let me make life easy for you." She believed him because she wanted to. Because the alternative, admitting that she was tired of managing everything alone, felt like failure. The engagement ring appeared on a snowy evening, exactly 6 months after they'd met. It was beautiful, expensive, and perfect. Calla cried. He held her close and whispered that her life was about to change forever. He was right, but not in the way she imagined. The first sign came 3 weeks after the wedding. She was making dinner when she noticed him watching her, really watching her, with an intensity that didn't feel like love. It felt like an assessment. "You look tired," he said quietly. "I had a long day at work." "Not at work," he interrupted. "Here, in our home, you're not taking care of yourself properly for me." The criticism was gentle, almost concerned. She adjusted her routine, prioritizing his comfort over her own rest. She told herself it was what marriage meant: compromise, sacrifice, putting someone else first. The controlling began so gradually that she nearly missed it. He suggested she cut her work hours. "So you can focus on us." He discouraged her from seeing her friends. "They don't understand our connection." He took over the finances. "A woman shouldn't have to worry about money. That's my responsibility." And slowly her world compressed. Her identity, once solid and defined by her professional accomplishments, began to blur. She became Rourke's wife. Everything she did was filtered through what he wanted, what he would approve of, what he believed she deserved. Then came the pregnancy. She'd been thrilled to tell him, imagining it would bring them closer. Instead, something shifted in his eyes, something possessive and dark. "This child will be mine," he said, his hand pressing against her belly. "You'll be mine, completely. No more boundaries, no more independence. You exist for me now." When she tried to protest, his voice never raised. He simply looked at her with those cold eyes and said, "Do you really think anyone would believe you? That anyone would care? You're nothing without me." And she realized, in that moment, that the chains had been fastening around her long before they were made of iron. The backyard came next. The medical facility wasn't a hospital in the traditional sense. It was one of Tavian's properties, a converted estate on the outskirts of the city with private rooms, top-tier medical equipment, and staff who understood the value of discretion. The kind of place where questions were never asked and records disappeared if needed. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked for Tavian for 5 years. She was the best in her field: trauma, emergency medicine, the kind of medicine required when people arrived with injuries that couldn't be officially reported. She'd examined everyone from gunshot victims to women beaten half to death by men who swore they loved them. But this case made her jaw clench. Calla lay on the examination table, covered by a thin hospital gown. The nurse had already removed the red dress, the shackle, and the physical evidence of her captivity. What remained was the truth written across her body. Dr. Chen began the examination methodically, her movements gentle, her face carefully blank. She had learned long ago that her emotional reactions could re-traumatize patients, but internally she was cataloging horrors. The infected wound around her ankle where the shackle had dug into flesh, the malnutrition evident in the hollow planes of her face, the protruding ribs visible through pale skin. The bruises, layers of them, old purple fatting into yellow-green, fresh ones still angry and dark. Bruises on her ribs, on her shoulders, on her inner thighs. And on her belly, the precious, vulnerable belly protecting new life, deliberate impact marks. The pregnancy is approximately 32 weeks, Dr. Chen said quietly, running the ultrasound probe across Calla's abdomen. On the monitor, the baby appeared, a fully formed human, moving slightly, unaware of the horror surrounding its existence. The child appears healthy despite the circumstances. That's fortunate. Calla's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. She hadn't spoken much since Tavian had brought her in 6 hours ago. She'd answered direct questions with single words or nods. Her mind seemed to be operating at a distance from her body, as if separating herself from physical reality was the only way to survive the knowledge of what had been done to her. Dr. Chen continued the examination. Blood work revealed severe anemia, vitamin deficiencies, stress hormones elevated to dangerous levels. The psychological damage was written in the lab results as clearly as physical trauma. Her cortisol levels were through the roof, her immune system compromised, her body in a constant state of fight or flight that had nowhere to go. "I need to ask you some questions," Dr. Chen said gently, pulling on fresh gloves. "I know this is difficult, but I need to understand your injuries. How long were you outside?" "2 days," Calla whispered. This time. The words landed like a physical blow. "How many times total?" Dr. Chen asked, though she already suspected the answer from the wound patterns. "I don't know, maybe 100, 200. Calla's voice was hollow. "I stopped counting after the first month. He said I deserved it, said if I couldn't be a proper wife, I could sleep with the animals." Dr. Chen's hand trembled slightly as she documented the injuries. She'd seen abuse before, but something about this case, the calculated nature, the extended duration, the way it had escalated until it became literal chains, felt particularly evil. "Calla, I need to examine you for sexual assault," Dr. Chen said quietly. "I know this is intrusive, but it's important." Calla's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. The examination revealed what Dr. Chen feared, evidence of repeated rape, the damage ranging from healing to fresh. The control work had exerted wasn't just psychological, it was total. He owned her body as thoroughly as he'd owned her choices. When it was over, Dr. Chen helped Calla into a clean hospital gown and waited while a nurse brought in warm blankets. The cold that had penetrated Calla's bones needed hours to leave. "You need to stay here for at least 2 weeks, Dr. Chen said firmly. "The pregnancy is at risk. Stress at this level can trigger premature labor. Your body needs rest, nutrition, and monitoring. And Calla," Dr. Chen waited until Calla's eyes met hers. "None of this was your fault. Do you understand me? What happened to you was not because of anything you did." Calla's face crumpled. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me. He said I deserved it. He said I was lucky He lied," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "He lied about everything. This is not your fault." The words seemed to break something inside Calla. She began to cry, not the quiet tears of before, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal. The grief of realizing, finally, that the narrative she'd been forced to accept was a lie. There was a knock at the door. Tavian entered without waiting for permission, his dark eyes taking in Calla's state with the kind of assessment that suggested nothing escaped his notice. "How bad?" he asked Dr. Chen directly. "Bad enough that moving her or pressuring her could cause labor," Dr. Chen replied. "The physical injuries will heal. The psychological trauma is extensive. She needs time, safety, and professional support." Tavian nodded once. He moved to the side of the bed where Calla lay, and his voice, when he spoke, carried something that wasn't quite sympathy but something colder, understanding. "Rourke Halden hurt you," he said quietly. "He convinced you that you deserved it, that you were responsible for his cruelty. That's what abusers do. They make their victims believe they caused the abuse." He paused. "He was wrong about all of it, and he's going to learn exactly what it means to be completely helpless." Calla's eyes widened. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Tavian turned toward the door. "What needs to be done?" he said simply. And as he left, Calla understood. Her abuser had just become the prisoner. 2 weeks had passed since Tavian brought her to the safe house. The room was beautiful, too beautiful for someone like her. Large windows overlooking gardens that were slowly beginning to wake from winter. Soft lighting. A comfortable bed with expensive sheets. Everything designed to feel safe. But safety, Calla was learning, was a cage of a different kind. She couldn't sleep without nightmares. Couldn't eat without her stomach rejecting the food. Couldn't sit in a room without tracking every shadow, every sound, every potential exit. The chains had been removed from her ankle, but they remained wrapped around her mind, invisible and inescapable. Shadow, the black dog, was the only thing that seemed to help. The animal slept curled against her, as if his body was a shield between her and the horrors she'd survived. She ran her fingers through his fur obsessively, grounding herself in the realness of him, the warmth, the reminder that at least one living creature had chosen her. There was a knock on the door. Tavian entered without waiting. He never waited. She was beginning to understand that patience was a luxury he reserved for those he cared about. For her, he simply appeared. "The investigator is here," he said simply. "He needs to go through everything with you. Names, dates, incidents, everything Rourke did." Calla's stomach clenched. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to be ready," Tavian interrupted. "But it needs to happen. The more detail we have, the more secure your future becomes." There was a calculation in his voice that should have frightened her, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. Tavian didn't pretend to care about her as a person. He was solving a problem, and she was part of that solution. There was honesty in that. Wallace Greer was waiting in the study downstairs, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime looking at human darkness. Over the next 4 hours, Calla told him everything. The financial abuse. The way Rourke had taken control of her accounts, liquidated her savings, left her completely dependent on his whim. The psychological manipulation. The names of people he'd influenced, his mother, neighbors, a lawyer who'd helped him structure agreements that left her without recourse. The physical abuse. Every incident she could remember, every escalation, every moment she'd believed she deserved the violence. The sexual assault, the rape, the methodical degradation. And finally, the chains. By the time she finished, her voice was a whisper, and her hands were shaking so badly that Greer had to help her drink water. "This is enough," Greer said quietly, closing his notebook. "More than enough." That evening, Tavian requested her presence in his office. The room was exactly as she imagined, all dark leather and expensive furniture, the kind of space that announced power. He stood at the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to emerge as night fell. "The documentation is comprehensive," he said without preamble. "Rourke committed felonies on at least 17 counts. Financial fraud, assault, sexual assault, unlawful imprisonment. If this goes to court, he'll spend decades in prison." Calla's heart lifted slightly. Justice. The word felt foreign but necessary. "But," Tavian continued, turning to face her, "the legal system is slow. It's bureaucratic. And there's always the possibility of lawyers, of appeals, of a judge who's sympathetic to men like him. He moved toward her with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested nothing he did was accidental. I'm offering you an alternative. What do you mean? She asked, though part of her already understood. Rourke will be imprisoned, Tavian said flatly. Not by the state, by me. He will experience exactly what he inflicted on you: captivity, helplessness. The understanding that his physical strength means nothing when he has no power. He will live in a cell. He will be dependent on others for food, for water, for basic human dignity. And he will understand, finally, what it means to be completely without choice. Calla's breath caught. The image should have horrified her, should have made her recoil from the darkness of what he was describing. Instead, she felt something dangerous bloom in her chest: satisfaction. How long? She whispered. As long as necessary, Tavian replied. Until you're healed enough to decide if you want him in the legal system or if you want him to disappear. The implication hung between them, not just prison, but erasure. Death, perhaps. The complete removal of Rourke Halden from the world. Calla struggled for words. That's not justice, that's revenge. Yes, Tavian agreed simply. It is. Justice is what you get through courts and lawyers and systems designed by people who have never been chained in the snow by someone they trusted. Revenge is what you get when someone with actual power decides your abuser deserves to suffer. He moved back to the window. I'm not offering you legal justice, Calla. I'm offering you something older, something more primal. The knowledge that the man who destroyed you will experience destruction. Calla's hands shook. She thought of the red dress, the chain, the cold, the way her baby had pressed against her ribs as if trying to escape a world that had already shown its cruelty. What happens now? She asked. Now, Tavian said, you decide. Do you want the legal system? Do you want him in prison where at least you know he's contained? Or do you want something darker? The question suspended itself in the air between them, a threshold she hadn't anticipated crossing. I need time, Calla heard herself say. You have it, Tavian replied. But understand this, whether you choose law or revenge, Rourke Halden's life as he knew it is over. The only choice you have is what that ending looks like. As Calla left the office, Shadow padding beside her, she realized that her captivity hadn't ended when the chains came off. It had simply transformed into something new, the captivity of choice, the burden of deciding her abuser's fate. And in the dark hours of the night, when the nightmares came, she wondered which kind of justice would finally let her sleep. The sitting room was dimly lit, a fire crackling in the fireplace. It was meant to feel intimate, safe, the kind of space where difficult conversations could happen. Calla sat with her legs tucked beneath her on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the room being warm. Shadow rested his head on her lap, his dark eyes tracking Tavian as he poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it. She appreciated that, the assumption of her agency rather than a request for permission. Why did you stay? He asked without preamble. Tavian didn't believe in small talk or easing into difficult topics. He moved directly to the center of what mattered. Calla wrapped her hands around the wine glass. I thought it would get better. Abusers do that, they apologize. They promise change. They remind you of who they were at the beginning, and you believe for just a moment that person might come back. But they don't, Tavian said. It wasn't a question. No, Calla confirmed. They don't. And after a while, you stop believing it's possible for them to change. You start believing it's possible for you to change. That if you just did everything right, if you were perfect enough, compliant enough, invisible enough, maybe you wouldn't trigger his anger. Tavian settled into the chair across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. You blamed yourself. Completely, Calla said, and the admission seemed to cost her something. He was so good at making it my fault. Every time he hit me, it was because I'd done something wrong. Every time he locked me outside, it was because I'd disrespected him. Every time She trailed off, unable to articulate the sexual violence. Every time he forced himself on me, it was because I'd withheld affection or didn't dress the way he wanted or looked at someone else in a way he deemed inappropriate. "Did you ever look at someone else?" Tavian asked quietly. "No," Calla said, "but it wouldn't have mattered. He would have found something to be angry about regardless. The anger was never about my actual behavior. It was about his need to control, to dominate, to reduce me to less than human." Tavian was quiet for a long moment. He sipped his wine, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It carried something raw and genuine that Calla had never heard from him before. "When I was 16, I was homeless," he said simply. "Living on the streets, stealing to eat, sleeping in places that weren't safe. A man approached me, said he'd give me work, a place to stay, money. I asked what the work was. He smiled and said, 'Whatever I need you to do.'" Calla's breath caught. She understood somehow where this was going. "I was vulnerable," Tavian continued. "I had nothing, no one, so I accepted. And the work was everything, illegal, violent, degrading. He owned me as completely as your husband owned you. The difference was he owned me through control of resources rather than through emotional manipulation and physical violence." "How did you escape?" Calla asked. "I didn't," Tavian said flatly. "I became him. I learned the language of power and control. I learned that violence was a negotiating tool. I learned that fear was currency. And I learned that the only way to never be helpless again was to become the most powerful person in the room." He paused, letting that sink in. "I don't say this to minimize your experience. I say this because I recognize it. I've seen what captivity does to a person. I've lived the aftermath of someone deciding your only value is what you can provide them." Calla set down her wine glass with trembling hands. "Is that why you're doing this? For Rourke?" "Partially," Tavian admitted, "but also because some men need to understand the language they speak. They need to feel, for once, what it's like to be powerless, to be dependent, to have every choice stripped away." He leaned forward slightly. "I've already arranged it. My people have located Rourke's movements. He visits a specific location every Thursday for what he thinks are private business meetings. This Thursday, he won't leave that location." Calla's heart began to race. This was happening. Actually, it's truly happening. "What will you do to him?" she whispered. "What he did to you," Tavian replied. "He will be imprisoned, confined, dependent on others for his survival. He will experience the helplessness he inflicted on you, but there's one critical difference. He'll understand intellectually why it's happening. There will be no question in his mind that this is the consequence." "For how long?" Calla asked. "As long as necessary," Tavian said. "Until you're healed enough to decide if you want him released to the legal system or if you want something more permanent." The implication hung between them, the possibility of his death, his erasure, his complete removal from the world. "Once this happens, there's no going back," Tavian continued. "The moment we take him, we're committed. If you have doubts, if you think you might choose the legal system instead, you need to tell me now." Calla thought of the red dress, the chain, her bare feet in the snow. The way her baby had kicked against her ribs like it was trying to fight its way out of a world that hadn't even begun and was already filled with violence. She thought of Rourke's mother, validating his cruelty, of the neighbor who saw the bruises and did nothing, of the lawyer who helped him structure agreements that left her defenseless, of the entire system that had failed her, that continued to fail women like her every single day. "Do it," Calla said quietly. Tavian stood, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of dark approval that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "It's done," he said simply. "By this time next week, Rourke Halden will no longer exist in the world you inhabit. He will be somewhere very different, somewhere he can contemplate the nature of his choices." As he left the room, Calla realized she was crying, not from fear or regret, but from something that felt almost like relief. The decision was made. The line was crossed. There was no returning to the woman she'd been, no hopping Rourke would change, no accepting his apologies. Whatever came next, she would face it as someone who'd reclaimed the power to choose, even if that choice led into darkness. If Calla's story has moved you, if you've felt the weight of her captivity, the complexity of her choice, the darkness that sometimes must be answered with darkness, we want to hear what you're thinking. Do you believe justice requires law, or are there moments when justice must exist outside the system? Do you think Tavian is saving her, or is he pulling her toward something equally dangerous? Like this video if Calla's journey has stayed with you. Subscribe to our channel because we don't believe in simple stories. We believe in the kind of narratives that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about survival, power, and what we're willing to accept in the name of healing. And most importantly, comment below. Tell us, in a situation like this, with institutions failing and a woman with nothing left to lose, where is the line between justice and revenge? What would you choose? Because sometimes, the most powerful moments in a story are the ones where we have to look at ourselves and ask, what would I do? We'll read every comment. Your voice matters. Because stories like Calla's, stories about the people the system forgets, they need to be witnessed. We'll see you in the next chapter, where everything changes. Thursday arrived with the kind of ordinary normalcy that made evil possible. Rourke Halden walked into the warehouse district of the city at 3:47 p.m., checking his phone, confident in the invulnerability that came from never having faced real consequences. He had no idea he would never leave. Dominic and 3 other operatives were waiting. They moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, not violently, not with dramatic confrontation, but with the kind of precision that left no room for resistance. A cloth soaked in sedative, an arm around his shoulders that looked friendly to any passing observer, a vehicle pulling up at exactly the right moment. By the time Rourke understood what was happening, he was already unconscious. He woke in a room that was utterly unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Concrete walls, a single metal bed frame with a thin mattress, a toilet in the corner, a small window with bars, positioned high enough that he couldn't see out, only enough to know that outside, the world continued without him. And on his ankle, the same kind of shackle he'd fastened to his wife, heavy iron, cold, anchored to a length of chain that led to a ring bolted into the concrete floor. Rourke's mind fractured in that first moment of understanding. This wasn't a kidnapping. This wasn't a negotiation. This was captivity, pure, simple, undeniable captivity. He pulled at the chain. The shackle bit into his skin. He screamed, not from pain, but from the absolute violation of his autonomy. He'd never been told no in any way that mattered. He'd never been forced into anything. His entire understanding of the world was based on the premise that his will was paramount. That premise was being destroyed in real time. Hours passed. He didn't know how many. Time became meaningless without light cues, without the ability to move beyond the reach of the chain. A guard in a mask and protective gear brought food, a tray of rice and water, nothing more. When Rourke tried to grab his arm to demand explanation, the guard simply stepped back, beyond his reach, and left without speaking. The silence was almost worse than violence would have been. On the second day, a voice came through a speaker in the corner of the room. Not Tavian's voice, someone else, someone official sounding. You're being held for crimes against Calla Halden, unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault, sexual assault, financial fraud. You will remain here until such time as the victim decides your disposition. Rourke's voice cracked when he tried to respond. This is illegal. This is kidnapping. You have no right. The speaker went silent. He realized, with sick certainty, that his rights had been voided the moment he decided he had the right to chain another human being. At the safe house, Calla learned about Rourke's capture through a simple text message from Tavian. It's done. 2 words, an entire world collapsed into simplicity. She didn't know how to feel. The relief she'd expected didn't come. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, the kind that comes when a burden you've carried for years is suddenly removed, and you discover you'd built your entire posture around supporting that weight. She sat by the window, her hand on Shadow's head, and tried to process the reality. Rourke was imprisoned. He was experiencing what she'd experienced. He was chained, confined, dependent on others for his survival. The satisfaction she thought she'd feel was mudded by something more complex. Guilt, maybe, or the recognition that she'd chosen darkness over justice and now had to live with that choice. That evening, Tavian came to her room. "He's secure," he said without preamble. "In a facility designed specifically for this kind of situation. He's being treated fairly, he has food, water, a bed. He's simply not free." "Can he escape?" Calla asked. "No," Tavian replied flatly. "The facility is designed to be inescapable, and I have people watching him. He won't hurt himself because he doesn't yet understand that he might want to." Calla felt something turn over in her chest. "You mean he will eventually want to hurt himself?" "Eventually," Tavian confirmed. "Captivity does that. It breaks something fundamental in people, especially people like him who have never had to consider anyone else's autonomy. The realization that they're powerless, that they can't manipulate their way out, that they have no control. It's corrosive." He moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "He's asking for you, by the way, demanding to see you. He thinks he can explain, can convince you of something. He's operating on the assumption that you're still the woman he controlled." "I'm not," Calla said quietly. "No," Tavian agreed. "You're not. The question is, what do you want to do about him now?" Calla had expected this question to feel momentous. Instead, it felt almost anticlimactic. "I want to see him," she heard herself say. "I want to look at him and understand how he could do what he did." Tavian nodded as if he'd expected this. "That can be arranged." "When?" "Tomorrow," he said, "if you're sure." Calla wasn't sure. She was terrified and confused and angry and sad all at once. But she also understood, with crystalline clarity, that she needed to see Rourke imprisoned. That seeing him powerless might be the only way she could fully believe in her own escape. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. That night, she didn't have nightmares for the first time since the chains came off. She slept deeply, shadow pressed against her, her hand resting on her swollen belly where her daughter grew, safe and sheltered, in a world her mother was finally beginning to reclaim. But when morning came, and the reality of what she'd chosen settled over her like winter snow, Calla understood something fundamental. She'd just taken another step into darkness, and there was no going back from it. In the basement room where he was imprisoned, Rourke Halden sat on his thin mattress and cried. Not from remorse, not from understanding, but from the absolute terror of someone who'd finally encountered a power greater than his own. He didn't know his wife was coming tomorrow. He didn't know that seeing her would shatter what little remained of his sanity. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was afraid. And fear, he was beginning to understand, was a language he'd never learned to speak. The basement room was colder than she'd expected. Concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting. The kind of sterile environment designed to strip away dignity. Calla stood in the doorway, flanked by Tavian and Dominic, her heart hammering so violently she could barely breathe. Rourke was sitting on the edge of the thin mattress. When he saw her, something flickered across his face, surprise, then relief, then what looked almost like anticipation. "Calla," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank God, you have to tell them this was a mistake. You have to tell them I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to chain me to a post in the snow." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You didn't mean to rape me. You didn't mean to take everything from me." Rourke's expression shifted. He was still trying to understand the rules of this new reality, still operating under the assumption that he could manipulate his way out. "I love you," he said, and the words were so familiar, so practiced, that Calla felt bile rise in her throat. "Everything I did because I love you, because I needed you to understand how important you are to me, how much you mean to me. You loved me so much that you made me believe I deserved to be chained like an animal," Calla said flatly. "You loved me so much that you convinced me your violence was my fault. You loved me so much that you destroyed every part of myself I valued." She stepped closer, and Rourke instinctively moved backward, pressing himself against the concrete wall. For the first time, Calla saw fear in his eyes, real, primal fear. The kind that came from understanding, finally, that he had no control. "Do you know what I realized?" she continued, her voice dropping so low he had to lean forward to hear her. "I realize that watching you suffer doesn't heal me, that knowing you're chained doesn't erase the memory of my own chains, that your imprisonment doesn't restore what you took from me." Rourke's face crumpled. "Then why are you here? Why did you agree to this?" "Because I needed to see you like this," Calla said quietly. "I needed to see that you're powerless. I needed to know that the man I was so afraid of is just a person. A small, broken person who only feels powerful when he's hurting someone weaker." She turned to Tavian, who had remained silent in the corner, observing. "I don't want him to disappear. I don't want him imprisoned indefinitely. I want him prosecuted. I want him in a courtroom where every detail of what he did is made public. I want him convicted by the legal system. I want him in prison where the truth of his crimes is recorded, documented, and real." Tavian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the way he was watching her. "Because that's the only way I move forward," Calla continued, directing her words as much to herself as to the men in the room. "Not by becoming like him, not by wielding power the way he wielded it, but by insisting that justice, real justice, prevails. Because if I let myself be consumed by revenge, if I let myself become someone capable of deciding his fate indefinitely, then he wins. He transforms me into the thing I've been trying to escape." Rourke reached out toward her. "Calla, please." "Don't," she said, stepping back. "Don't speak to me. Don't touch me. Don't pretend you understand what you've done. Your denial, your apologies, your crocodile tears, they're all part of the same manipulation you've been using on me for years." She looked at him fully, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted. The man who had terrorized her was just a man, a coward, a broken person who'd chosen to break others rather than face his own brokenness. "I'm going to press charges," Calla said. "Every single one. The financial crimes, the assault, the rape, the imprisonment. I'm going to testify in court. I'm going to make sure that everyone knows what you did. And I'm going to walk away knowing that I chose the path of actual justice, not the path of becoming you." She turned to leave. "Wait," Rourke called out, his voice desperate. "What happens to me? How long do I stay here?" Calla paused at the doorway without turning back. "That's not my decision to make anymore. You wanted control so badly. Now you know what it feels like to have none." As she left the room, Tavian followed her. They didn't speak until they were upstairs, away from the concrete and the fluorescent lights, back in the world of the living. "You surprised me," Tavian said quietly. "How?" Calla asked. "Most people, given the power to destroy their abuser, take it," he replied. "They choose revenge. They choose the satisfaction of seeing someone hurt the way they were hurt. You chose something harder. You chose to become someone other than him." Calla's legs felt weak. She sat down heavily on a sofa, her swollen belly pressing against her thighs. "I don't feel noble. I don't feel strong. I feel like I just gave up the one thing I thought I wanted." "That's because you didn't give it up," Tavian said. "You released it, that's different." He paused at the doorway. "Rourke will be transferred to police custody tomorrow. The evidence is overwhelming. His conviction is certain. He'll spend decades in prison, but he'll spend them knowing that his victim, you, chose not to destroy him. He'll spend them knowing you're out there, building a life, healing, moving forward. That's a different kind of punishment, one that might actually teach him something." After he left, Calla sat alone with Shadow, her hand on her belly, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief exactly, not peace, but something like clarity. She'd chosen legal justice over vengeance. She'd chosen to remain fully human rather than becoming a weapon of revenge. She'd chosen the harder path. And tomorrow, when Rourke was transferred, when the legal machinery began its slow, methodical work of prosecuting him, she would begin the real work of healing. Not because she destroyed her abuser, but because she'd refused to destroy herself. The cottage was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that caught the morning light, a living room with a fireplace that actually worked. Calla stood in the doorway, the key heavy in her hand, and felt something unexpected, possibility. She'd purchased it with her own money that had been returned to her through the legal process, seized from Rourke's accounts, restored to her as partial restitution for the financial abuse. It wasn't much. He'd spent most of it on his lifestyle, but it was enough for a down payment, enough to own something that was hers alone. Her daughter, Emma, had been born 4 months ago on a spring morning when the world was finally warming. The delivery had been difficult, but successful. Dr. Chen had placed the baby in her arms and said, "You did it! You survived the unsurvivable and brought new life into the world." Now, at 6 months postpartum, Calla was beginning to understand what survival actually meant. The therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Morrison, a trauma specialist, happened twice a week. They were brutal and necessary. Calla would sit in the comfortable chair in Dr. Morrison's office and slowly, piece by piece, begin to reconstruct the narrative of her life. Not the narrative Rourke had written for her, the one where she was responsible for his cruelty, where she deserved her captivity, but her own story. One where she was a woman who'd been victimized, but was choosing, every day, to become something more than her trauma. "The nightmares are normal," Dr. Morrison had said. "So are the triggers. When you hear a certain tone of voice, when someone moves suddenly, when you feel trapped in any way, those are your nervous system remembering. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're healing." The trial had been 3 months of testifying, 3 months of sitting in a courtroom and describing, in precise detail, every way Rourke had hurt her. 3 months of his lawyer trying to minimize her injuries, suggesting she'd misunderstood his intentions, implying she'd provoked him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The medical records, the photographs, the financial documentation, the testimony from Dr. Chen, from neighbors who'd finally decided to speak, from the investigator who'd compiled everything into an undeniable portrait of systematic abuse. The conviction had come on a Thursday afternoon. Rourke was sentenced to 15 years, not the life sentence Calla had hoped for, but a significant portion of his remaining years. As the gavel came down, she'd felt not triumph but exhaustion. The legal process had drained something from her, not her strength, but the last of her belief that institutions would protect her. Still, he was imprisoned. He would spend years in a cell, supervised, monitored, removed from the world. Now, 6 months after that verdict, Calla was learning what came after justice, the quiet work of rebuilding. She'd found employment at a small accounting firm, the same work she'd done before, but now for a boss who respected her, who noticed when she was struggling, who never demanded more than she could give. The work grounded her. Numbers were honest. They didn't lie or manipulate. They simply were. Shadow remained her constant companion. The black dog had aged since the captivity, his muzzle graying, but he followed her everywhere with the devotion of an animal who understood loss. Emma adored him. Her tiny hand would reach out and grip his fur, and he would remain perfectly still, tolerating the attention with the patience of something that had learned gentleness through shared suffering. One evening, as Calla was preparing dinner, simple food, nothing elaborate, just the quiet satisfaction of feeding herself and her daughter, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Tavian. He looked different in her home, out of place. His expensive coat seemed wrong against the modest setting of her cottage, but his eyes, when they met hers, carried the same cold clarity she'd come to associate with him. "I wanted to check on you," he said without preamble. "See how you were settling in." "I'm fine," Calla said and meant it. "Better than fine, I'm building something." He stepped inside at her invitation, moving through the space with the careful precision of a man assessing security. But his gaze softened when it landed on Emma, sleeping in her bassinet in the corner of the living room. "She has your eyes," he said quietly. "She has her father's face," Calla replied, "but I'm trying not to hold that against her." Tavian moved to the fireplace, his silhouette sharp against the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried something she hadn't heard before, vulnerability. "I've been thinking about what you said, about refusing to become like me, about choosing justice instead of revenge." He paused. "I've spent 20 years becoming the kind of man who solves problems through control and power, watching you choose something different. It made me question some choices I've made." Calla waited. She'd learned that silence was sometimes more powerful than words. "I'm not going to change who I am," Tavian continued. "That's not possible. but I'm trying to be more intentional about it, about when I use power and when I step back. You showed me that restraint is actually more powerful than action." He turned to face her. "I came to tell you that you don't need me anymore. You're not dependent on my protection. You've built something on your own, a home, a job, a life. That was the point, wasn't it? Not rescue, but independence." Calla felt tears prick her eyes. "You're leaving." "Not completely," Tavian replied. "If you ever need me, I'm available, but I won't be hovering. I won't be inserting myself into your life. You've proven you don't need saving. You only needed someone to remove the obstacle." Shadow approached Tavian, and the man reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears with surprising gentleness. "He's a good dog," Tavian said. "He knows what it means to survive something terrible. That's a bond." After Tavian left, Calla sat with Shadow and Emma, the fire crackling softly, and felt something shift inside her. Not relief exactly. His presence had been comforting in its own dark way, but something like freedom. She'd survived. She'd rebuilt. She was building a life that was hers, not Rourke's, not Tavian's, but truly, completely hers. But as she looked at sleeping Emma, at the future stretching ahead of her, a new question emerged. Could she truly move forward when part of her would always carry the weight of what had been done to her? Could she build a life on the foundation of trauma, or would that foundation always threaten to crack? The answer, she was beginning to understand, wasn't simple. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a process, and the journey ahead would define not just who she was, but who her daughter would become. 1 year. Exactly 1 year from the day Tavian had cut the chains from her ankle, Calla stood in her cottage with her daughter playing on the floor, Shadow resting beside her, and felt the kind of peace that seemed impossible just months ago. She looked different now. The hollowness in her face had filled in. Her hair, which had been matted and damaged, now hung in thick waves past her shoulders. The bruises had long since faded. The infection from the shackle had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar, a reminder but no longer a wound. More importantly, she looked like someone who belonged to herself. Emma was walking now, wobbly, determined, utterly fearless in the way that only children could be. She would pull herself up on furniture and laugh when she tumbled back down, and Calla watched her with the knowledge that this child would grow up knowing safety, would grow up with a mother who understood the weight of autonomy, would grow up in a world where captivity was impossible. The cottage had become a home. The walls were decorated with photographs, not memories of the past, but evidence of the present. Emma's first smile, Shadow on the porch, Calla at her desk at work, competent and professional. These were the narratives she was writing for herself now. Her job had become more than employment. She'd impressed her employer so thoroughly that she was being promoted to senior accountant, with the possibility of eventually becoming office manager. The work fulfilled something in her, the precision, the logic, the knowledge that she was good at something and was valued for that competence. Therapy continued twice a week. Dr. Morrison had evolved from a guide to something more like a trusted ally. They still worked through trauma, but the work had shifted. No longer excavating wounds, but learning to build resilience around them. "You've done remarkable work," Dr. Morrison had said in their last session. "The transformation from where you were to where you are now, it's extraordinary." "I don't feel extraordinary," Calla had replied. "I just feel like myself." "Exactly," Dr. Morrison had smiled. "That's the point, you've gotten yourself back." There was a knock on the door at sunset. Calla opened it to find Tavian, but not the version of him she'd come to know. He was dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, and he carried a small box wrapped in simple brown paper. "I come bearing gifts," he said without preamble. "For Emma's first birthday. I'm assuming that's coming up soon." 3 weeks, Calla confirmed, stepping aside to let him in. Emma immediately crawled toward him, her fearlessness with people extending even to this dangerous-looking stranger. He settled onto the floor with surprising gentleness and let her pull on his fingers. "She has excellent grip strength," he observed. "Good genes on one side, at least." Calla laughed, something she was doing more of now. "Open it, the gift. I want to see what a mafia boss thinks a 1-year-old should have." He opened the box to reveal a small leather-bound journal. I know it's probably years before she can use it, but I thought she should have a place to write her own story, not the story her father tried to write for you, her own. Something in Calla's chest softened. That's beautiful, really. They sat together as evening deepened into night. Tavian had brought food, expensive takeout from a restaurant Calla would never afford on her own, but now allowed herself to enjoy occasionally. Emma ate small pieces of soft chicken and laughed at the mess she was making. Shadow lay between Calla and Tavian, equally comfortable with both of them. "How are you?" Tavian asked as Emma began to wind down towards sleep. "I'm good," Calla said and meant it completely. "I'm actually good, not managing well, not surviving well, actually genuinely good." "That was always the goal," Tavian replied. "Everything I did, everything I chose for you, it was so you could be here, so you could reclaim your life." "I know," Calla said, "and I'm grateful, but I'm also glad you're not here all the time. I need to know I can do this on my own, that I'm not dependent on you the way I was dependent on Rourke." "You're not," Tavian assured her. "That's clear. You've built something substantial, a life that's entirely yours, that's genuine independence." After Emma was asleep in her crib, after Tavian had left with a promise to return for the birthday celebration, Calla stood on her porch and looked out at the darkness. A year ago, she'd been chained to a post in the snow. A year ago, her life seemed finished. A year ago, she couldn't imagine a future that didn't involve pain. Now she stood in her own home, paid for with her own money, earned through her own work. She'd reclaimed her career. She'd given birth in safety. She'd testified against her abuser and watched him receive justice. She'd processed her trauma with professional help. She'd built relationships based on choice rather than captivity. The chains were gone. Not just the physical ones, but the psychological ones too. She no longer believed she deserved suffering. She no longer accepted responsibility for another person's cruelty. She no longer questioned her own worth. Shadow came and pressed against her leg, and Calla ran her fingers through his familiar fur. The dog had aged visibly over the year. His time in captivity had left marks that couldn't be fully erased. But he'd also learned to trust again, to rest peacefully, to know safety. In the distance, a car drove past. Headlights swept across the porch. For just a moment, Calla's nervous system registered a threat, but it passed. The car continued on. She remained safe. And she understood, finally and completely, that this safety, this autonomy, this ownership of her own life, was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not the imprisonment of her abuser, not dark justice, but the simple, profound ability to exist on her own terms. The chains had been broken long ago, but only now did she truly feel free. Calla's story doesn't end with her escape. It ends with her becoming someone she thought she'd never be again, herself. She was chained to a post in the snow, stripped of everything. But what the man who owned her never understood is that true freedom isn't about removing chains. It's about a person brave enough to rebuild after they're gone. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you'd choose, what justice really means, what it takes to reclaim a life, then this is the kind of story that needs to be heard, needs to be shared. Like this video, subscribe to our channel because we tell stories about survivors, about people the system forgets, about the quiet courage it takes to choose yourself. Comment below and tell us, was justice served, or did Calla have to become something darker to find it? And if you want to see what happens next in Calla's world, comment part 2 and let us know. Because some stories don't end, they transform. Thank you for witnessing her journey. We'll see you next time.